This is episode 46, Verbals, and this is our final video for the series. Our last video we looked at sentences that dress up as one function only to perform as another, and well, verbals are very similar, and I've avoided putting them in all my examples for this series because they would have just made all my examples a little bit muddy and added questions and confusions, so I've just not put them in there. But before we wrap up this series, I think it's really important to bring them in for you to see how they work as well and what they are. So let's take a look at them now. Verbals are words that dress up to look like verbs, but actually they're something else. And there are three types of verbals. Let's have a look. We have the gerund, the infinitive, and that's both with to and as a base infinitive as well, and the participle. So let's start with the gerund. Let's see what that is. Now the gerund looks like an ing verb, except that it's not functioning as a verb, it's functioning as a noun. Take a look at these three sentences here. We have swimming is fun, I like running, and he was afraid of flying. Now in these three sentences we have three different gerunds: swimming, running, and flying. In the first sentence, swimming, as we are aware of our functions, therefore know that this is the subject of the sentence. And another thing we know, because it's the subject of the sentence, is that it has to be a noun or noun phrase. So you cannot have a verb as the subject of a sentence. And if we look at this whole sentence, we can see that it has a subject, swimming, it has a verb, is, and then it has a subject complement, fun. So if swimming is a subject, it can't also be a verb. It is in fact a noun. Okay, so let's have a look at the next sentence, I like running. Now the best way, if you're really not sure what the word class or the word form is in a sentence, is that we can take another word that you think is in the same word class and substitute it. So for example, I'm telling you now that running is in fact not a verb, it's a noun, and the verb in this sentence is like. So what I'll do is I say, all right, well, let's choose another noun and see if it fits the same. So let's put fish. So does that work? I like fish. Yes, this is a perfectly valid sentence. But what happens if we do put another verb there? What about play? Play is a verb. I like play. Well, that's not going to work. The only way I can make that work is if I put an S on the end of it, therefore turning the play verb into play noun with S plural, and once again it's fulfilling that noun role. So if I substitute the word running, I can only substitute it with a noun for it to make sense. And also that's because this is the direct object of the sentence, and the direct object of the sentence is never a verb. So in this situation, it looks like a verb, but in fact, it's not a verb, it's a noun. Okay, if we look at the final sentence here, he was afraid of flying. Well, I'm going to use syntactic clues to be able to find out what this particular word class flying is. And the way I'm going to do that is by noticing that it's part of a prepositional phrase. And I bet you can remember what it is that we said about prepositional phrases and what they are made up of. If not, I can tell you now that a prepositional phrase is made up of a preposition and a noun phrase, okay? Or a noun in this instance, which is the full noun phrase. So you cannot have a prepositional phrase or a preposition followed by a verb. Syntactically, that doesn't make sense. So if we look at all of these situations where we see words that look like verbs, we can do different tests to find out whether they are in fact verbs. One is to see what function it is. If it's the subject, well, it can't be a verb. Another way we can find out is by doing a substitution test. And if another noun fits in for that word, well then it's going to be a noun. And finally, we can look at it syntactically. And we can see that, well, if it fits syntactically into a sentence where you would expect a noun to be, such as here up with swimming as well, then of course we know that that can't be a verb also. So in these three sentences, we have three words that look like verbs but are in fact not verbs. Okay, they're not even playing the function of verbs. Now we can see ing words in a sentence that are not a gerund but are in fact the ing form of the verb. Let's have a look at that. Here's one here. I am swimming tomorrow morning. So how do I know that this swimming is in fact a verb and not a noun? Well, we need to first of all look at it and where it's sitting in the sentence. So semantically it means the same thing, but in this situation it is in fact the main verb of the sentence and it has an auxiliary verb before it. Now I know this is an auxiliary verb because it is one of I am, he is, you know, she is, and so on and so forth. And is, do, and or be, do, and have are our three sort of main auxiliary verbs, and then we have separate modal auxiliary verbs. Okay, so I know that this is playing as an auxiliary and it's being followed. It's in the ing form, this verb here, because it's talking about something that's happening over time. So it's giving us aspect of time. Okay, so in this situation, the noun does not fit. It has to be a verb in this sentence, and that's because syntactically it fits in as a verb, like we've looked many times. So this is how swimming differs as a verb and as a gerund. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is the infinitive. This is the next way that's a type of verbal. Now the infinitive is where we have the base form of the verb, such as eat, and we can have it with or without to. So we can say to eat, or we can say eat. Generally speaking, we say the infinitive is to eat and the base infinitive is eat. It actually plays the role not of a verb in a sentence, but of a noun, or most often, but sometimes it can also be an adjective or an adverb. So let's have a look again at these following sentences and see how they play different roles in the sentence and perhaps aren't verbs, even though they look a little bit like them. Okay, so the first one here is I live to eat. Now if we break this down, I is the subject and live is the verb. And to eat is fulfilling the role of a direct object. And as we know, the direct object cannot be the verb, it has to be a noun. So in this situation, to eat here is not a verb, but it's actually a noun. Now it's interesting to note here that we can use to eat after like as well. I like to eat. I live to eat. And whether to use the gerund or the infinitive in many situations when they're both being the direct object and they're both acting as a noun, it's probably one of the most difficult parts for people learning English as a second language to learn at an advanced level. And it's something that really comes through exposure because the rules behind it have so many exceptions that it's very difficult to learn it any other way. All right, let's have a look at the second one. He called to warn her. So to warn her in this instance is giving us information about why he called her. So called is the verb, he is the subject, and to warn her is saying why he called her. So therefore, I'm sure that you remember that must therefore be an adverb because the adverb is giving us this information about where or when or why something is happening. So to warn, I shouldn't have really undercovered her there, that's not actually part of the adverb. To warn is the adverb there. All right, so let's have a look at the next sentence. He had some things to do. Now, to do in this instance is actually describing the things that he had. So things is a noun, and anything that describes things or a noun is in fact an adjective. So here's a situation where the infinitive form of the verb is acting as an adjective. Finally, we can look at the sentence, to cook is what I like. So in a similar case with the gerund, to cook in this sentence is in the subject form of the subject part of the sentence, and so therefore it has to be a noun or noun phrase, because that's the only kind of word class that can go in as a subject. It was very hard for me not to put as this example to be or not to be, because of course to be is one of the most famous uses of the infinitive at the beginning of any kind of sentence. Now, this shows us therefore that the infinitive is not necessarily the verb in the sentence, even though it kind of looks like one. And there are similar cases or special verbs where the infinitive is used in its base form without the to, and they're even harder to spot as not verbs. And these verbs are usually related to emotions or senses. So examples of verbs that would be followed by a base infinitive form of the verb would be words like feel, hear, help, let, make, see, and watch. And of course this isn't a definitive list, but it certainly gives you a good indication of the kind of verbs that are used that are followed by a base infinitive. So let's have a look at the example I've provided here. He turned when he heard the telephone ring. Now let's break down this sentence and have a look at it. We've got he is the subject and turned is the verb. And this is actually a complex sentence because we have our conjunction here, when, and we have the new subject here as a pronoun, and heard, the past tense of another verb here, to hear, and of course this verb hear or heard takes the base infinitive of, which in this instance is ring. So what did he hear here? He heard the telephone. The telephone is the direct object. It is what he heard. Now, I didn't actually teach you what we call the object complement. And that's what the role of this ring is playing in here. It's playing the object complement. Now, just like the subject complement, where the subject and the subject complement are basically talking about the same thing, the object and the object complement are doing something very similar. He is my brother Harry, where my brother and Harry are basically two pieces of information about the one thing. So this is a situation of the object complement. So similarly, the telephone ring, when he heard the telephone, when he heard the ringing of the telephone, and when he heard it ring. So the telephone and ringing is effectively the same thing. It's just giving two different ways of expressing the object, and in this situation therefore ring is the object complement. And the object complement has to have the same class or word form as its object. So therefore the telephone is a noun. We know this because the definite article comes before it, the determiner, and ring therefore also has to be a noun. But it's not a noun as in a ring that you put on your finger. It is in fact ring object complement. So I can see how that it gets a little bit confusing at times, but there's an example of where a base infinitive form of the verb is not in fact a verb. All right, if I haven't confused you enough already, we're looking now at the final verbal, which is the participle. Now there are two forms of the participle. There's the present participle, which is another form of the ing verb, kind of, except it's a gerund. So, no, it's not a gerund, it's a participle. So the gerund is like swimming is fun, and we saw that as the noun form. We've got the ing form of the verb as in I am swimming, which is actually a verb and it's showing continuous form. And finally we have the ing form, which is the present participle, and we can see that in the second sentence here, the sleeping child didn't stir. Now if we look very closely here, the sleeping child is the subject of the sentence, and it's made up of the head noun, the determiner, and The sleeping is describing the child, so therefore this is actually an adjective because it's describing the child. So in this situation, sleeping looks like a verb, but in fact it's an adjective describing the child. And that's an example of a present participle in action as an adjective. The first sentence is an example of the past participle. Now the past participle is the third verb when you do your eat, ate, eaten, play, played, played. And you do those three verbs. You've got present, eat, past, ate, participle, past participle, eaten. Okay, we use it after the is in a passive voice. We use it after the have in the perfect aspect. And here it is here being used as an adjective in describing the package. So if we break this down, she is the subject, returned is the verb, and then we have the direct object here, which is the opened package. So the package is the noun, the is the determiner, and right in here we have opened, which is describing the package, and of course that anything that's describing the package or describing a noun is going to be an adjective. So therefore opened, what looks like a verb, is actually a past participle that's behaving as an adjective. And finally we have to the shelf here, which is an adverbial. We could put a to the swaying shelf. Oh, the shelf is swaying. And in this instance, swaying is not a verb, but it's a present participle describing the shelf. All right, so that's it. There are your three types of verbals: the gerund, the infinitive, both the to infinitive and the base, and finally the participle, both the present and the past participle. So what are verbals? If we were to summarize it really abruptly or briefly, we would say, or I would say, that verbals are words that look like verbs, but they aren't verbs. Okay? And so I have to find out whether they're verbs by asking myself, what is the function? How do other words look in the same place? Substitution, and questions like that. Okay? And that's how I know whether a verb is a verbal or a verb. Okay, so that is actually the very last video in this series. This series was aimed to cover word form, word function, sentence type, sentence functions, and a couple of exceptions, such as these verbals here today. And I think that we have covered that pretty well. So my aim, of course, is to move on to a new kind of series, and I think that this next series will probably be morphology. So I'm going to look at the different types of morphology and how we break down words into smaller parts. There'll be a period where I'll just get all the things I want to say together so it can be presented to you in a very coherent way. So I might not be back in the next couple of weeks, but another couple of weeks I'll be back with morphology. In the meantime, there will be worksheets going up slowly here at this website, www.thelanguagecode.com. When I get time, I will do them. It's something I need to do for my own students anyway. I'll put them up when they're done. And that for now is me. And I will see you again in a few weeks' time with a new series called Morphology. In the meantime, thanks for watching The Language Code.